Dr. Michael Alexander is a PhD economist, a best-selling author, a DTM, and a fellow of the International Innovation Institute. But more importantly, knowledge and accomplishments pale in importance in comparison with avoiding falling for misinformation. And as an expert in epistemology, the study of what we know and how we know it, that is Dr. Michael's bread and butter. Fellow Toastmasters, I present Dr. Michael Alexander with "It ain't what you don't know that gets you, it's what you do know that ain't so." Dr. Michael Alexander.
I want to start off, we promised an interactive session. So if you all look at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. And there's a red X and a green check mark. So let's start off here. How many of you believe that the sun revolves around the earth? Check yes. 3 of you believe the sun revolves around the earth. Now, how many of you believe that the earth revolves around the sun? And let's use the red X just to keep them separate. Marcia's voted twice. And by the way, Marcia, you're the only one who's right. The fact of the matter is, you're all wondering, what is he playing at here? You're being cute in your answers. But everybody knows that the earth revolves around the sun. Do they? Do you know it? Or do you just believe it?
Believe it.
I'm willing to bet that there is at most one person here who can tell me an actual thing they've seen or experienced, which proves that the earth revolves around the sun. And I got news for that one person. That doesn't prove what you think it does. As Rosa said, we don't know it, we believe it. We believe it because we were told by a teacher. And we believe she knew what she was talking about. Or we believe it because we read it in a book, which we believe was written by a scientist. And we believe that that matters. But let me talk to you a little bit about scientists. A few centuries ago, scientists explained that the entire universe was made up of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Now, the Asians had spirit thrown in there as a 5th element, but we in the West knew they didn't know what they were talking about. It was the 4 elements. And then somehow over the course of time, they decided, well, it isn't actually 4 elements, but it's molecules. The smallest fundamental unit is a molecule. And then they started to look at some stuff, and suddenly what we knew for a fact changed. It wasn't molecules, it was atoms. And that's as small as it could possibly get, an atom. And then Rutherford and Hayes shot X-rays through the atoms and discovered, no, that wasn't right either. It was electrons, protons, neutrons. But come on, guys, we're scientists. We know the truth. That's it. And then the cyclotrons developed quarks and scions and a whole bunch of other little tiny particles. And now scientists have discovered the God particle. Sorry, Deepak, the God particle is not what you want to unify with. Scientists have discovered God. And every year, science, tells us something different than it told us before. And yet, when science contradicts religion, we say, go with the science, because we know it'll change again. But we know that Bill Nye, with 3 seasons on television and a bow tie, trumps 1,500 or 6,000, depending upon your religion, years of consistency from religion and a yarmulke. Folks, the fact of the matter is we have to be careful what we believe. And we have to stop thinking we know what the truth is because some guy with a bow tie has told us the truth. And we have to stop denying things that don't fit with science. A few centuries ago, when the Western world made contact with India and the rest of the Eastern world, they discovered that Indians had this crazy theory that sickness was caused by imperfections and introductions of things in your karma. And these karmic variations would actually interfere with the proper functioning of your organs. This is, of course, when the West knew that the truth was that you had too much bile or phlegm or any of the other 4 humors, and that all medical problems could be solved with leeches. But a few centuries later, they said, oh no, it's not actually the 4 humors. Sickness is caused by little tiny things in your body called bacteria that interfere with the function of your organs. And if you get in contact with someone else who has these disruptions, you can get sick. And the Indians said, isn't that what we told you when you told us we were idiots? The germ theory. Well, that's, again, be careful who you listen to and be careful what you believe. Now, I looked at a study a few years ago, came out in the 80s, which proved that cancer of the pancreas was caused by drinking coffee. This was in a refereed journal. But before you give up your Starbucks cards, and I can see you all waffling through your wallets to get rid of your Starbucks cards, I had a chance to look at the study. And you know what? They did it backwards. They looked at people with cancer of the pancreas and discovered more of them drank coffee than people who did not have it. And you know what that proves? That proves cancer of the pancreas causes coffee drinking. Now, this is not unique among the errors that happen in medical studies. In fact, it's all too common. Any of you look at the studies which talked about the relative efficiency of the COVID vaccines? Well, if you had, you will notice that they were all based on univariate analysis. Fancy word I have to use because I'm an economist. Univariate says there's the exact same probability of any number of cases, that unless there is the interaction of a medication. Well, if you'd studied statistics even in high school, you saw this bell curve which said there's a high peak and a low peak, and the more extreme things got, the less probability there was. And that means that the standard analysis, which by the way, they are required to use under FDA regulations, is completely wrong. And by the way, that same requirement says there's an equal probability of any amount of disease, which says you could get half a case of COVID. And this is the kind of studies they do to look at medicine. Is it any wonder that they periodically discover medicine is less effective than they said it was? Well, when I was studying statistics, my professor explained to me that you couldn't tell things with absolute certainty, but we worked with 95% confidence intervals. So we were 95% certain. So I raised my hand and said, doesn't that mean that one study out of 20 is garbage? I would love to tell you that I got an A in that course, but I didn't. But now you will discover a whole bunch of studies if you look at the newspapers where they've come out and they've run a statistical analysis. And they've discovered all sorts of interesting things. Did you know that your income affects how likely you are to brush your teeth? No, it doesn't. Now, we used to know, solid economic theory, that sunspot cycles affected the economy. Makes a lot of sense, right? The sunspots affect solar winds, affect the radiation that comes to the earth, that affects crop growth, which affects and flows through the whole economy. It makes a lot of sense until you actually look at the statistics. Crops grow faster or slower before the sunspot cycles occur. So again, statistically, crops cause sunspot cycles. Maybe all this science isn't all it's cracked up to be. In 1971, at the American Statistical Association annual convention, a meeting of the top statisticians in the US, or at least the ones who were best funded, they asked a simple test question. What do you need to know if the following statement is true? Every time analyst A says that the stock market will go up, it goes up. Now, the answer seems kind of obvious. Is there any case where he said it would go up and it went down? You would think that all of these highly paid statisticians would get that question right. 25% did. So be very careful when you start trusting scientific reports. Now, you can't just, if we want to talk about what you know that isn't true, stick with the scientists. Read a newspaper sometime. Then read a newspaper with a different political opinion. You're going to get a different answer. And the number of times I've looked at YouTube where they promise an example of where person A rips apart senators during congressional committees, and you actually watch the video, and they don't rip apart the senator in the least. In fact, they hardly even argue with them. But if you only read the headlines, that's what you get. Now, sometimes reporters don't understand things. Sometimes they have a slight bias. There's a story, apocryphal, of a new lion who just was brought over from Africa. And everybody went to see him. And one little boy got too close, and the lion reached out through the cage and grabbed the little boy and opened his jaw wide. Well, there was a big burly biker nearby, strong enough that he punched out the lion and rescued the boy. Well, the newspapers thought this guy was a darling. And so they asked him to tell them of himself. And he said, well, I'm a biker, and I organize the annual Toys for Tots run. He said, I have organized blood drives for the Red Cross. I have a 3-year-old son. I'm a Republican. And you know what the newspaper reported? Republican attacks newcomer to the US and steals his lunch. How many of you here, you want to hit the buttons again, how many of you here floss because your dentists have told you that it's important to floss? And those that don't, how many of you at least believe that it's important to floss, even if you don't do it? The federal government is forbidden by law to recommend anything that has not been proven scientifically. There has never been a single study done of the effectiveness of flossing. Not one. And yet the government tells you you should do it. The government is forbidden under the Delaney Clause to allow any food additive which is known to cause cancer in any degree. Does any of you know of a single artificial sweetener that doesn't cause cancer? I don't. And yet the federal government encourages them. So don't necessarily trust the federal government. I'm old enough to remember the 4 basic food groups. You all know the 4 basic food groups, don't you? Pizza, potato chips, chocolate chip cookies, and beer. Well, arguably, chips are from a tuber, not a vegetable, but beer is made with grains, so it's one of the 4, it is one of the 4 basic food results. Cookies, again, flour, wheat, absolutely. Pizza, you start with the basic bread crust, the cheese, the vegetable toppings, the onions, olives, peppers, and pepperoni. That's meat. It fits the 4 basic food groups. But they tell me it's not healthy. Well, they changed the 4 basic food groups to different percentages. And then they came up with a food pyramid. Well, you know what's really interesting? They had the next one ready to go before they announced the food pyramid, but they didn't think the Americans were ready for it yet. Why, if you would start thinking about thinking for myself and stop believing what the scientists tell me, and I would stop believing everything that the federal government tells me. Now, I'm an economist, so I feel it's necessary that I add into my list of things to be careful about economic advice. Many of you have heard of an investment guru. What's your favorite investment guru?
Buffett.
Buffett. You know, David is the one who keeps guessing these things. He's got a pretty good record here. Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is an investment genius. And if you want to do well, invest in Berkshire Hathaway. I'm an economist, and I believed that for years. And then I compared his performance with simple index funds from the NASDAQ. NASDAQ outperforms him. I don't got to be a genius to buy index funds and to lose money to Warren Buffett. So please, folks, think for yourself. Realize the stuff that you read can be wrong because they don't understand, they don't do the studies right, or they didn't do the studies. Realize that the government breaks the law in recommending things to you, and they recommend things that aren't right. And that's before we get into all the political things that I don't want to touch right now. But I'd worry about those too. Now, this is when any good speaker likes to wrap things up for you in a rainbow. Give you a call to action. Give you something you can work with and take with you. I can't do that for you tonight. All I can ask you to do is start thinking for yourself. Don't believe everything you're told. And if it doesn't make sense to you, keep looking, keep trying. But I will offer you this. Marcia was right. The earth doesn't revolve around the sun, and the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. Einstein would tell you that it's all relative and it doesn't really matter. It's all a matter of perspective. But actual studies, actual mathematics show that the earth and the sun both revolve around a common center of gravity. So the book you read, the teacher who told you the truth, nah, not quite. Even something as basic and well known as the earth revolves around the sun and the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, it ain't necessarily so. But I will offer you this. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and you risk pancreatic cancer, look out your window to the east and you will see the sun. Back to you, David.
All right, thank you, Michael. Interesting perspective on things. Kind of reinforces what my father told me years ago, that you believe nothing you hear and half of what you see. One question, I think start with, in fact, the only person I felt who outdid our top 3 economists were the Pelosi's, if I understand. How'd that happen? My real question though is with the science. How many of these so-called science and whatever, I don't know how they phrase it, when they come up with whatever they say they come up with, is it primarily ego that they want to see something published in their name, they just got to come up with something? There's not really looking for the real science in it.
A lot of it is that, and referee journals, you only publish in a referee journal what you think people will accept. Now, I don't want to get too trapped in the world of global warming, but I will tell you that if you look at what all of the models predict for global warming, it's not right. The Earth is warming much faster than that. So the whole carbon dioxide thing, the models aren't right. And I will tell you that a friend of mine did a study where he looked at sunspot cycles and discovered it predicted a lot more than CO2 did. And in fact, CO2 became statistically insignificant. Maybe you're right, maybe wrong. It's a study, but it's worth looking at. But if he were to try to publish that in a referee journal, they wouldn't do it. If he were to try to get a grant money for that study, he couldn't get it. So can you find anything that argues with the CO2 causes global warming theory in a referee journal? No. And not because it's true, because the fads of science won't permit it. Anyone remember Indiana Jones? Of course you do. Well, if you actually look at the history of the dinosaur wars, it was pretty much like Indiana Jones. They were shooting each other. They were stealing each other's work, stealing each other's samples, because the scientists wanted to prove they were right. And they didn't care about that. I could talk about evolution on the same. I could go on for days, folks. And David asked the question, and David's the timekeeper, so I don't know how bad I'm doing, but blame him. Yes, Leslie.
I have a question. Okay, I have a question and a comment regarding vaccines. So are you saying the studies of the vaccines showing that they're ineffective? Can you explain that more in a little lay language?
Sure. You can't actually prove anything. You can only sort of say that the statistics support the concept. Now, if you use the wrong kind of statistics, you're going to get bad answers. So I'm not saying, just within what I said here, I'm not saying that vaccines are not effective. I'm saying that if you compare the effectiveness, you may discover that the different levels of effectiveness are very different than what you thought they were. the Pfizer versus Moderna, people got very uptight about 0.5%. And the fact of the matter is the statistical variation, the uncertainty, how little we actually knew was a whole lot bigger than that. And so, and by the way, and again, I don't want to get too far into any one subject here. I have written an article on COVID. As I like to say, tell people, I am a doctor. I'm just not a physician. But my PhD in economics is actually more relevant to statistical analysis than your doctor's ability to put pills in a bottle. But the stuff I am starting to see indicates that there are insufficient studies to show that the new booster vaccine is actually effective, the newest one.
Okay, are you finished with your response? I don't want to interrupt you.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay,
I hope that-
and I just want to share with you that I recently was taking care of my grandkids who are in high school, and I'm into like a little bit of nutrition study, and my granddaughter is showing me the food pyramid, and not up to the latest food pyramid, and they actually included sugar with fats. I said, how did sugar get on the food pyramid? And also there's a whole category of dairy. And I've been listening to a lot of books and things about food, pharma industry, and it's like how they control the government. And it's like how they're on the panels that make up these things. And it's not necessarily by scientists or dietitians, it's who runs the politics. And it's like, and also I've been aware of a couple of historical books, the 1619 Project and the People's History. And it's talking about genocides and racism. And it's like, it's not stuff that we were taught in school. And if you're raised in California, I'm kind of older. We were raised that the missions were these wonderful places. And now you find out the missions were actually concentration camps and slave labor. And it's like, I'm not even sure about what we're teaching in school and how do we choose who's teaching it. And it's like history is supposed to be written by the conqueror. So it's like what you're saying is kind of like things that I'm getting to be aware of. And so thank you for sharing this. I appreciate it.
Just one small note there. We say history is written by the conqueror. I was trained prior to the Vietnam War, of course, that America never lost a war. We lost the War of Canada. You remember the slogan 54-40 or fight? That's where we wanted to draw the line with Canada, basically from Maine straight across the top. We lost that war. We weren't the conquerors, and we still wrote the history. Marcia, I see your hand up.
I have a question for Mike. Mike, I didn't ask you this before. I want to know, what do you think about global warming?
All right. There are a couple of things to talk about here, and I can go. We got to be, are we okay for time, David? All right. The fact of the matter is the Earth is right now warming. This is not the first period in history in which global warming has occurred. And in fact, global cooling occurs. I will point out to you that in the 1970s, we were terrified of global cooling. And the front cover of, I believe it was September 1970 Newsweek, was about the coming ice age. I still remember that fear mongering. Now it's going the other way. So global warming is happening. The question is it caused by humans? And will it continue? And as I've said, it's obvious to me that the models are wrong because the Earth is not warming at the rate that is predicted by the CO2 models. And yes, we did give a former presidential candidate, a former vice president, an Academy Award for an uncertain truth, I would remind you all that Academy Awards are not given for scientific accuracy, they're given for entertainment value. The models are not right. Now, it may be that CO2 produces it. Has anyone explained to any of you why CO2 causes global warming? No,
Greenhouse
they can't.
effect.
And they say the greenhouse effect. Well, the greenhouse effect basically says that sunlight hits the atmosphere, the ionosphere, and bounces back down. And so we keep warm instead of it escaping. The trouble is that same barrier would cause sunlight coming in to bounce off. So this whole effect doesn't match. And if CO2 makes that bounce worse coming down, it would also make it stronger coming up. It's really hard. And there's absolutely, I haven't heard a single scientist try to explain to me why it works. They simply, basically will quote an Academy Award-winning movie. I think we need to think about it seriously.
All right, thank you, Michael. Any other questions before we go on to our last comments from your chair here?